The proposed Superfund site at Smurfit Stone Container represents a very different suite of toxins in the environment relating to the pulping and paper mill industry.
Those contaminants are possibly moving up the food chain and affecting human health. So it's not just an environmental issue, it's a human health issue.
There's been a lot of work done in terms of environmental contamination that's related to the Clark Fork River.
The alluvial groundwater has the contamination from the mill site.
Scientific studies have shown that whether it's air pollution or wastewater pollution, paper mills across the nation release a large amount of hazardous materials into the environment. These materials are unhealthy for animals, and they are linked to a number of harmful health effects in humans. The federal government has regulated the release and treatment of these pollutants since 1970. But today, paper production is still one of the largest polluters of freshwater ecosystems. Even though the use of digital media has reduced the need to produce paper, it has created a new problem. The loss of business has led paper companies to declare bankruptcy. Closed industrial sites that operated for decades, like the Smurfit Stone Paper Mill near Missoula, Montana, have left large, unlined wastewater lagoons that retain toxic waters on the edges of rivers and streams. The Environmental Protection Agency began Superfund evaluation of the Smurfit Stone site in 2012. The EPA concluded that dangerous toxins in the Smurfit Stone lagoons are polluting the adjacent Clark Fork River.
We did find some environmental contamination at the site that consisted of dioxin compounds, metals including lead, arsenic, and manganese.
Initial assessment manager Rob Parker joined the Environmental Protection Agency in 2009. This project is the first Clark Fork River project he has worked on.
We found elevated levels of manganese in the surface water and elevated levels of a dioxin compound in the sediment.
Previous studies say it's clear that the water is unhealthy for animals. But what is not known is if this water is unhealthy for humans. The other unanswered question is how far this contamination has moved downriver. And Montanans won't get these answers unless the Smurfit Mill becomes a national Superfund site. Parker says contaminated water and sediment from the mill site could have washed downstream hundreds of miles into Lake Pend Oreille, Idaho, and even beyond into the Columbia River.
The next step is to complete the remedial investigation. That's designed to determine the nature and extent of contamination.
Anything the water touches could be affected, including livestock, agriculture, and sports and recreation.
You know, I don't know why they haven't run a study on down below there.
Joe Cantrell has operated a fishing guide service in St. Regis, Montana for 19 years.
You know, they got smallmouth down there, bass, largemouth. They got on down in Oxen, I know they got a lot of walleye.
St. Regis is roughly 56 miles downstream from the Smurfit Stone Mill.
All I know is the stone container place up there, I'd sure like to see that cleaned up.
Workers at the mill created a pure white piece of paper by bleaching wood fibers in a chlorinated solution.
When they stopped the bleaching process, whatever that was there, that whatever was being dumped in the river at that time really had an effect on our bug life, the hatches in the river. And when they stopped that really helped.
Study results distributed by the U.S. EPA show that insects in the aquatic ecosystem are some of the first organisms affected by pollution.
I'm sure the bug life is the first thing to go when it's really badly polluted, you know.
I mean, even when the mill was active, they had pipes that came out of the settling ponds and released effluent into the river.
Matt Potter owns the Kingfisher Fly Shop in Missoula. He says he's watched wastewater from the mill flow into the Clark Fork River, something that's happened for nearly 60 years.
My understanding is that was predominantly organic. I never personally observed any health issues with the fish. Whether they were picking stuff up in their tissues, I don't know.
It had to go down the river somewhere, you know, and that's got to be, that isn't laying in these slow water eddies around here, has got to be laying in that dam down there.
The Montana Department of Environmental Quality recently discovered that chemicals discharged into the Clark Fork River affect more than the insects.
They're also bioaccumulate, meaning they move up the food chain.
Keith Large has been a project manager at the Montana Department of Environmental Quality for 19 years. For more than a decade, he's worked closely with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, testing fish to learn if toxins from the mill are accumulating in their tissues.
They did this about 10 years ago, and the level of contaminants in the fish tissue were down low enough that they weren't concerned.
But when Fish, Wildlife, and Parks conducted these same tests in 2013, results showed increased levels of these toxins in fish tissues.
Anything that eats fish or eats things in the aquatic environment is going to accumulate a lot of these elements over time and could cause deleterious problems for their health.
Research biologist David Schmetterling works as the Fisheries Research Coordinator for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. He began his studies with pollution issues related to the Clark Fork River in the mid-1990s.
The effects of PCBs, dioxins, and furans in the environment, all of which are common byproducts of the pulping and paper mill industry, are present at this site, and their role in the environment is very, very complicated. It's going to take a while to really understand the effects to aquatic life and those animals also that depend on aquatic life.
According to the Centers for Disease Control, contamination of animals can occur in many ways: breathing smoke particulates, ingesting or touching contaminated water, or eating plants or other animals that have been exposed.
It gets stored up in animal flesh and tissue, and that's why long live fish and fish that eat other fish, accumulate toxins.
Dioxins and furans are not naturally occurring elements. They are waste products from making paper.
Common byproducts of the pulping and paper mill industry are present at this site, and their role in the environment is very, very complicated. In 2013, we did some preliminary investigations into fish downstream of the mill, ones that would be most likely in contact with effluent from the mill.
They caught these fish and they took tissue samples out of the fish, and they found dioxins and PCBs in these fish tissues.
That finding led Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and other state agencies to send out a public health notice that said no one should eat the northern pike taken from the Clark Fork River. For trout, the advisory is a bit different.
It's not specifically no eat, they're severely limiting the number of fish you eat.
The state health department has recommended that if people want to eat trout out of the Clark Fork River, they should only eat 4 meals containing the fish each month. Cantrell says it is too early to know how this consumption advisory will affect Montana's fishing industry.
Up until a few weeks ago when they put out this, the word again about eating no pike, I don't know what effect that's going to have on my business here.
Fishing guides say most people who pay for Montana angling adventures are from out of state, and they travel to Montana without knowing about the consumption advisories for fish taken from the Clark Fork River.
99% of the people I take are catch and release anyway, so they're not eating the fish out of the river.
Studies conducted by the Centers for Disease Control say that people who recreate on the river downstream from the mill site are at risk. Once people are exposed to PCBs, dioxins, and furans, the toxins enter their bloodstream and store in fatty tissues. It is uncertain how many people are accumulating these toxins. To answer these questions, the EPA will conduct studies to gauge these toxin levels in humans if the mill site enters the second step of the Superfund process.
You can go for years, you know, with small amounts till it's too late, you know, and then it kills you.
The fish consumption advisory for the Clark Fork River is in effect for a 110-mile stretch from the confluence of the Bitterroot River to the confluence of the Flathead River.
In that stretch of the Clark Fork River, there is bull trout, and those trout are native to Montana and they're on the endangered species list.
Ranging from invertebrates to things that eat those invertebrates like fish, and then the things that eat fish. And then you can get very far off site.
The 110-mile stretch may not be enough. Trout are a salmonid species. Like steelhead, their ocean-going cousin, trout swim to the headwaters of the river or stream they were born in to spawn. It's understandable that every waterway that enters the Clark Fork River could have contaminated trout in it at one time or another during the year. But fish consumption is not the only concern for human exposure.
It's likely that these toxins persist in other places. For example, there's a lot of, there's irrigation that takes place downstream of the site. There's shallow groundwater wells.
The pollutants have a number of paths to get into food, but so far no state or federal agencies have looked into human exposure. The EPA will conduct those tests if the area is named a federal Superfund site.
In the coming years, as we continue to do different assessments and evaluations, we'll have a better understanding.
The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry says people may expose themselves by breathing, eating, drinking, or direct skin contact with the substance. At other locations, exposure led to the development of acne and swollen eyelids. The agency reported skin rashes, vomiting, diarrhea, anemia, lung infections, and neurological effects. The EPA has conducted no studies to ascertain the levels of these toxins or long-term effects of exposure to former workers at the Montana Smurfit Stone site.
So we're suggesting that to the EPA that those studies need to take place.
The Agency for Toxic Substances says that people and animals can accumulate 10 to 100,000 times higher levels of these pollutants in their bodies than the levels that are recorded in the water, in the air, or in the river sediment.
So it's not just an environmental issue, it's a human health issue. PCBs and dioxins are known to be bad news for human health. So,
and that's really the benefit of the Superfund site, being able, or a Superfund listing, is being able to holistically evaluate all the different pathways for these chemicals to affect human health as well as ecological health.
Superfund Preliminary Assessment Manager Rob Parker completed the tests on a small section of the river in 2012. Before the EPA studies a larger stretch of the Clark Fork River, the Smurfit Stone Mill will have to move past the initial Superfund testing phase. If it does, a different project manager will conduct tests to evaluate what risks the site poses to human health.
That remedial project manager's task is to perform a more detailed remedial investigation to determine the full nature and extent of contamination.
EPA Project Officer Sarah Sparks worked for the Montana Department of Environmental Quality before she joined the EPA in 1987.
The most important thing that you need to know before you start cleaning up the site is what's there.
There are essentially 6 steps to the Superfund process. Right now, the Smurfit Stone Mill is in the first step, the initial assessment that was completed in 2012. The second step is where superfunding begins. That's when scientists conduct tests to determine the total extent of contamination and all the hazards involved.
And what that means is, what kind of contamination is at the site and how much of it is there. Is it affecting groundwater, surface water, people's drinking wells, air, soil contamination?
After the agencies discover where and how the contamination is entering the river, they will ascertain how far contamination has spread downstream. Then they will know more about the hazards to human health. The agencies will then begin the feasibility study. This is a study that looks at the different methods the EPA could use to remediate or clean up the toxins.
From there we move into what we call the record of decision, or ROD process.
The ROD is based on what officials think are the best methods to clean up the toxic materials. When state and government agencies support this decision, the actual cleanup begins.
And that's a major milestone about halfway through the process. And once the record of decision is finalized, then you move into what we call remedial design and the remedial action.
Keith Large works as liaison between the Montana Department of Environmental Quality and the EPA on a number of other Superfund sites upstream from the Smurfit Stone Mill. Large says there are several ways the Smurfit Stone cleanup could go.
Sometimes waste is left in place and treated in place. It all depends on the site. I've never worked on any of these Superfund sites that are the same. They're all different. They're all complex and have different issues.
After cleanup is finished, the site enters the operation and maintenance step, and officials monitor and do any maintenance needed to assure the pollution is not recontaminating the environment. The Clark Fork River has a long history of environmental degradation and restoration. If the Smurfit Stone site moves past the initial assessment phase, officials will face another problem with assessing responsibility for cleanup costs. There are 5 different Superfund sites that have already polluted the waters of the Clark Fork River before it reaches the mill. It could be hard for EPA scientists to pinpoint where certain toxins have entered the watercourse.
I'm not quite sure if you can fingerprint them to determine where they're from.
If the EPA conducts additional tests in connection with the Smurfit Stone Mill and discovers that the toxins it found during its initial assessment entered the river upstream, federal courts could order the responsible parties to pay further costs incurred with the cleanup.
What we do need to do is to look at upgradient sources from the Smurfit site to determine if we're actually getting contamination from the Bonner Mill or from other areas that may have dioxin or furans associated with them.
DEQ project manager Keith Large says these studies are important to ascertain where the pollution is originating because it enables officials to mitigate them and stop the pollution from further contaminating the river.
Now, studies can be done to try to determine exactly where it came from, but those studies haven't been done yet.
The current owner of the mill site is the Green Investment Group. Corporate president Ray Stilwell says the company is concerned about the previous testing. He says federal and state samples would not have been able to ascertain whether pollution was from the mill or from upstream. There is a long history of former owners at the Smurfit Stone site. Horner Waldorf built the Frenchtown Technologies and Industrial Center in late 1957. 20 years later, Champion International purchased the Waldorf holdings and acquired the mill site. In 1986, Champion, just before Champion became International Paper, sold the property to Smurfit Stone. Smurfit Stone declared bankruptcy in 2009 and ceased operation.
It's complicated, not just technically and legally, but the current landowner did not operate the facility. They bought it out of, after the bankruptcy of Smurfit Stone.
Eventually, the Green Investment Group purchased the site. In a bulk transaction, Green Investment paid nearly $20 million. The group planned to develop a biofuels refinery and manufacture wood pellets at the Montana site, but it had to stop the process until the EPA reaches a decision on the Superfund status. It is unclear whether Green Investments' cleanup plans included pollution in the river.
It doesn't matter to me whether it's a Superfund site, a state Superfund site, federal Superfund site, or if it just gets cleaned up by a private entity, as long as it's done properly.
Green Investment Group declined to be interviewed concerning the property. The group currently owns 7 former Smurfit stone mills and has funded similar cleanup at 3 of them. Under federal law, all previous and current owners could be held financially liable.
So you have a couple different players in there. None of these folks have come to the state, to the DEQ, and asked if they could work out some kind of deal to start addressing the risk that are out there.
EPA Initial Assessment Manager Rob Parker confirmed that the former and the current owners have submitted comments to the EPA during the public comment periods in an effort to stop the Superfund process from going past the initial assessment stage. State agencies have become concerned that the previous and current owners don't want the EPA to do a more detailed study at the location.
Well, I mean, the bottom line is it's private property, and there's always several ways to get to the same endpoint. But what it'll take is a commitment and willingness of the owners of the mill to want to assess the situation and do a cleanup.
Lad Notek is a managing biologist for the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks in Missoula and Mineral counties, which covers the site downstream from Missoula.
If it needs to be a Superfund site, so be it, but someone needs to take responsibility and clean up the site.
And I'm hoping through the Superfund process that all these sites get tested and all those pathways that might lead for toxins from the site to lead into whether it's agriculture, people's kitchens, and other things get evaluated. And that's really the benefit of the Superfund site.
If the EPA decides not to list the Smurfit Stone as a Superfund site, EPA scientists will never make an environmental assessment or conduct tests to evaluate the risks to human health. That means Montanans may never know the dangers involved or where the toxins have entered the river.
The EPA in Denver folks are working on this. Thought maybe they would list it in March 2014, but there was too many. They had a public comment period about the site, and they have to respond to every single comment and document those.
The more comments the EPA receives, the more time-consuming the process becomes.
There was I think a 30-day public comment period that was then extended to 60 days. And they're trying, down in Denver, they're trying to work through all that.
EPA Initial Assessment Manager Rob Parker says 93 groups and individuals have submitted comments. He says a vast majority of the comments received from the citizens of Montana want the EPA to move forward with the Superfund process, while the majority of comments submitted by former owners and potentially responsible parties do not want the site to move forward into the Superfund process. Parker says the reason for the EPA's 2-year delay is because it is attempting to work with parties who could be held financially responsible. But because the site has changed ownership so many times in the past, it is unclear who's responsible.
And so our involvement at the site is to answer those questions.
EPA project managers say it is imperative that responsible parties contribute to the testing procedures. This would reduce the amount of taxpayer resources needed to pay for the concentrated remedial efforts.
The other aspect of the cleanup too is it's extremely expensive, and so the funding aspect always is going to tie in, and so Superfund is one of those processes that forces the work to get done even when it is extremely expensive.
In comparison with former Superfund efforts that took place upriver in Butte, if acreage alone dictates the cost to clean up the 3,200-acre Smurfit Stone mill site, then responsible parties could be liable to pay more than $300 million.
That current owners are interested in taking care of some of it.
John Ingen has been the mayor of the city of Missoula since 2006.
Frankly, unless, I think what we've learned over time is unless folks are somehow required to engage in that cleanup, unless the responsible parties are at the table, stuff doesn't get done.
Green Investment Group attorneys stated to the Missoulian that there is insurance to cover cleanup costs. The EPA has the financial authority to cover the cleanup and then sue the potentially responsible parties to reimburse these funds.
Somebody will probably not be happy if it's not listed. Of course, I can tell you the companies will probably not be happy if it's listed. So it's a two-way street. It's also a public process.
Cleanup at the site isn't going to happen overnight. After all, it took more than 50 years of paper production at the Smurfit Stone Mill to bring the river to its present condition.
I couldn't give you a timetable per se of how everything's going to go down. We will begin the process of dealing with companies or parties that had ownership in the site.
At this point in time, it's too early to tell exactly how long this process will take.
Federal law will require one or more of the former owners to pay for the remedial activities. The site's current owner, Green Investment Group President Ray Stilwell, still hopes for a private cleanup effort. He says that cannot begin until the EPA makes its decision to list or not list the site.
What I think I know about Missoula is that there's always a desire for these brownfields to be cleaned up to the highest possible standards. I mean, we have that at play right here in the city, and I think that's probably the case out there as well.
If the EPA does not list the site, we may never know the overall risks to human health and the environment. If the EPA lists the Smurfit Stone Mill, it will move to the second step of the process, and EPA scientists will conduct more tests.
Based on those sampling activities, we'll know how much contamination we have there.
That information will really enable the remediation process to be done effectively and really explain the scope and scale of the project. Without that ecological risk assessment and any assessments about human health, I think that any kind of cleanup or remediation would fall really short.
Cleaning up is a dirty game, ladies and gentlemen.